After today's story, you might find yourself looking at the packaging and sealing of medication that you buy over the counter a lot more closely. But before we get into that, I ask that if you like what you see here, that you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you may receive word of any future uploads. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at Chicago back in 1982. On the morning of September 29th, 1982, Adam Janus would wake up and he started experiencing what was cold-like symptoms: headache, fever, maybe even some cold sweats. He decided, I'm going to call into work today and I'm going to take the day off, rest, relax, try and get up to full capacity and go back to work tomorrow. After he called his boss, he went to go and spend a few minutes with his kids before he decided to lay down, just to discover that his wife had already taken them to preschool. So he went out to his car, got in, drove to the preschool, picked them up, and on his way home, he decided, you know what? We don't have any Tylenol at the house. I'm going to stop and pick up some Tylenol so that way I can, kind of deal with this fever I'm having. After he picked Tylenol, he drove the rest of the way home. After getting home and after a couple hours, they decided to sit down as a family and have a nice lunch. And shortly after lunch, Adam would tell his wife, I'm not really feeling any better, so I'm going to take a couple of Tylenol and I'm going to go lay down for a little while. And she was okay with this. She told him, get some rest. I'll see you in a little while. And after about maybe an hour or so, she went to check on him, see if he needed anything: some soup, a cold rag, maybe some more Tylenol. And when she walked into the room, she saw that he was convulsing on the bed, which was just a heart-stopping image to walk into. She would immediately rush over and try to help him, or at least find a way to try and help him. But ultimately, she decided to call the paramedics and beg them to rush to the house to save her husband. When the paramedics arrived, Adam was completely unresponsive. He had labored breathing, his blood pressure was all over the place, and they decided that it was best idea to immediately take him to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Adam had slipped into a coma. And shortly after that, when he was moved into the ER, he would sadly pass away around 3:15 p.m. Shortly after his untimely passing, Dr. Kim would go and inform the family of what had happened, but he was finding it hard to find the words to explain how a young and healthy man suddenly suffered from cardiac arrest, and there was absolutely nothing he could have done about it. Shortly after this, the family would return back to Adam's home to try and console and comfort each other while also making funeral plans. A little while after all of this started, Stanley, his 25-year-old brother, would start walking around the house trying to find some sort of pain relief as he was getting a headache, probably caused by the grief. His wife would assist him in looking for something, and on the kitchen counter they found a bottle of Tylenol. They both popped a couple of capsules, and not long after that, Stanley started grasping his chest and would eventually collapse and start foaming at the mouth. Immediately, paramedics were called, and when the paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, his wife Teresa was now also on the ground experiencing a seizure. They were both immediately rushed to the hospital. Now, back at the hospital, Dr. Kim was getting ready to leave for the day until a nurse came up to him and said, "Hey, Dr. Kim, the Janus family is coming back in. They've got another emergency." And he assumed that it was the parents because they were so stricken by grief. But little did he know that it was actually his brother. And that nurse would explain to him, no, it's his brother, and they're actually performing CPR on him right now. And his wife is also with him, and she's also not very responsive. When he heard about the brother, he thought, okay, maybe he just passed out from the stress or the grief. But when he heard about the wife, it really started raising questions like, what is going on with this family? So as soon as they arrived, he put them all under observation until he could try and get some idea of what was going on. He would also quarantine the house to prevent the spread of whatever might be happening. A team of investigators was put together to go investigate the Janus house and see exactly what was going on. And when they arrived, they looked for carbon monoxide leaks. They looked for any sort of other substance or contamination that might be causing this, but they found nothing. What they did learn, however, is that Adam had taken some Tylenol right before he had experienced the convulsion and eventually slipping into a coma. So they would remove this Tylenol from the house and bring it back to hospital. When they returned back to hospital, They learned that Stanley had passed and that Teresa was now in critical condition. In that same evening, on September 29th, a fire lieutenant named Philip would receive a phone call from Marge, who was his mother-in-law. She would state that her friend Virginia Kellerman's daughter, Mary Kellerman, had passed earlier in the day. Now, Mary was only 12 years old, and she lived with her parents in a neighborhood that wasn't too far from where the Januses lived, and it made Philip wonder if it was all somehow connected. On the morning of September 29th, Mary would wake up for school. She was currently in the 7th grade, so she had to be up around 6:30. She would wake up this morning to feeling pretty sick. She had a fever, some cold sweats, and a sore throat. She would go and tell her parents about this, who after a brief discussion decided it was probably best to keep her home that day. Shortly after they decided this, they gave Mary a Tylenol capsule and had her take it and sent her back to bed. Shortly after that, they would hear a loud thud of either what sounded like someone falling over or falling down, or just something with significant weight to it being dropped. And they heard this in the direction of Mary's bathroom. So they immediately walked over to Mary's bathroom, and when they opened up the door, they found her unconscious on the bathroom floor. When they discovered Mary on the bathroom floor, they immediately called 911. When the paramedics arrived, she was in full cardiac arrest. They immediately scooped her up, put her in the ambulance, and rushed her to the hospital. But sadly, she would pass at 9:56 a.m. Now, there was a lot of speculation about the cause of death for Mary from cardiac arrest, which really wouldn't make a lot of sense at her age, as she was only 12 years old, to carbon monoxide, but a lot of eyes were pointed towards her parents for some sort of foul play. The police would go and investigate the Kellerman's house, but after not really finding anything out of place or anything questioning or bizarre, they ultimately said, the Kellermans aren't at fault. What they did discover, however, is that she took a Tylenol right before she collapsed. At about 4 p.m. on September 29th, Mary McFarland would tell her coworkers that she felt a headache coming on, which wasn't incredibly uncommon, as she was plagued with many migraines, and she always had this plethora of pain relievers with her to be able to combat that so she could work without being disturbed by the pain in her head. She would then go to a break room and pop a couple Tylenols, try and deal with the headache, but shortly after that, she would complain about nausea and dizziness before collapsing and becoming unresponsive. She would be taken to the hospital, and they would try and figure out exactly what's going on, but she would pass the following morning around 3:18 a.m. On September 23rd, a 27-year-old woman named Mary Reiner had just given birth to her 4th child. Shortly after the birth of her newborn son, and right before she got discharged, a nurse would come in to give her a bag that had an assortment of stuff to help with the pain after labor and delivery. About 6 days later, on September 29th, she would start experiencing some after pain from all of this, and she would take a couple Tylenol. Shortly after, she would experience some nausea and some dizziness, and she would eventually collapse. Even though she was rushed to the hospital almost immediately, she too sadly would pass around 6 p.m. the following day. On October 1st, Stanley Janus's wife, Teresa, would pass away. She was declared brain dead by the attending doctors and would be the 6th victim of whatever was going on that was causing these strange deaths in Chicago. The following day, Carol would receive a phone call from United Airlines about her sister Paula not showing up for work. This was creating some concern, as she was typically never late and she was always on time and never missed a flight. So her sister would go in and check on her. She got to her apartment and she knocked on the door, but didn't get a response, so she took out her key and let herself in. When she walked inside, she went around the corner and she saw Paula lying on the floor, completely motionless, and she walked over to find out that her body was actually cold. She had been there for 2 days. 2 days prior, she had returned on a flight into O'Hare National Airport, and on her way home, she was feeling a little bit of a headache and some body pain after dealing with passengers and walking up and down the airline all day. And after she bought this Tylenol from Walgreens, that would be the last that anyone really saw her alive. The bottle of Tylenol that Paula had bought at the Walgreens 2 days prior was still sitting on her bathroom counter with the cap off. Now, after these 7 strange and unexplainable deaths that happened in a 24-hour period in Chicago, the testing that was on it brought some alarming discoveries to light. Tylenol powder is typically white and it's not very clumpy. It's just a nice fine powder and it won't dissolve in water. However, the powder that was found in these capsules inside the bottles that was taken was gray, kind of lumpy. It was crystallized and in fact would dissolve. On further testing and some toxicology reports from the victims, it was discovered that this powder that they found in the capsules was cyanide. Now, cyanide is a pretty well-known poison, and it takes about 5 to 6 milligrams for it to be lethal. But the amount of cyanide that was found in these capsules was 65 milligrams, which is more than 10,000 the amount that you need for it to be lethal to someone. During the investigation, after the link was connected between the deaths that linked it back to a Tylenol, it all led back to Johnson & Johnson. Now, Johnson & Johnson was completely unaware of what was happening up until a reporter called asking for a comment on the recent deaths that was connected to their product. They immediately put together an investigation team. They started with an internal investigation, but after stating that there was no way it happened there, that all their employees turned up clean after an internal investigation, and that they did not have cyanide at their facility, that the tragic mix-up did not happen there. As word began to spread about what was going on and where it was originating from, which was the Johnson & Johnson facility, people started to wonder if it was a disgruntled employee that was just trying to get back at the company, and that would only be a more believed speculation as they discovered that Johnson & Johnson wasn't exactly truthful in their original statement. Johnson & Johnson at that facility did indeed have cyanide that they used for chemical testing, but they would say that the lab that they did that chemical testing in was in a remote part of the facility and very far away from the distribution part, so there was no way it could be mixed up. They did turn around and find other bottles from the batch numbers that were shipped to Chicago and test them all for cyanide, and there was no tampering with them. An almost mass panic started to spread throughout Chicago as the word started to spread a little bit more also, with people calling in saying, I have a headache, I'm feeling nauseous, I'm feeling dizzy, I passed out earlier today, but none of these claims would prove to be cyanide poisoning. After Johnson & Johnson did a mass recall nationwide, and even a few people turned in some bottles that did test positives for some cyanide capsules, the attack stopped at 7 victims. Those 7 lives were very tragic to lose, but it could have been a lot worse if this was not handled in such an exceptional way that Johnson & Johnson did. Investigators are trying to find the culprit of who is committing these horrible acts of replacing the actual Tylenol powder with cyanide, 65 milligrams of cyanide at that. Put them in all sorts of directions. They were looking at family members, co-workers, friends, anyone that might have been trying to target a single person but ended up taking out more people than intended. This did not pan out to show anything, but there was one incident that was pretty interesting. Was one night 2 officers were going to grab dinner, and outside the restaurant where they were going, they saw a cardboard box. And on that cardboard box it said, extra strength Tylenol bottles. And inside there were 6 bottles missing, but that still left 24 bottles in there. But also on the ground, there was a bunch of white powder, or at least what appeared to be white. And there was also some strung out capsules. They would pick up all these parts and materials, or at least one of the officers would, and they would put it inside their car. They would then go sit down and eat dinner, but during dinner, the officer who handled those materials would start to get a headache, and he appeared to be getting a rash on his arm, and it was actually starting to swell up. After they left dinner and went back to the precinct, they would take that and they would go and put it in evidence. And this was on September 28th, prior to any of this happened, so they didn't really report it. But they would go put it in evidence anyway, and the officer who handled it this time experienced the exact same symptoms: a headache, a rash, and his arm started to swell up. Now, after the attacks were discovered the following day, they would report it, and everything that was tested on the box, the bottles, the powder that they discovered, all tested negative for cyanide. The investigation was turning up no likely suspects. However, Johnson & Johnson would receive some letters from an individual claiming that they were responsible for the attacks, and they would only stop if they received $1 million, and they listed an account number. That account number was traced, and it actually went to an owner who had closed the account 5 months prior. That owner was not the one who sent the letters. The person who sent the letters was James Lewis. Now, He wasn't arrested for the attacks because there was no definite evidence that he actually did it, because him and his wife lived in New York and they had no connection to Chicago, and all the attacks were localized in Chicago, which leads back to Johnson & Johnson clearing their name from the facility. But James Lewis would be arrested for extortion, and he would serve 13 years of a 20-year sentence. Since his release, he's denied all responsibility to killings, and there is still no suspect or any apprehension or arrest of anybody who committed these crimes. The FBI would look into James Lewis a little bit more about 25 years later, and they would investigate where he lived. They found some DNA evidence, but nothing to incriminate him further. The FBI would even go as far as looking into Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and they would get DNA testing from him, but he would also say, I have no responsibility in this. To this day, there's been no arrest or solid suspects in these 7 murders in the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders. However, this did prompt the FDA to create the packaging and the tamper-proof sealing that is now used on medication to this day. That's all I got for today's story. I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it and you want to see more of this content, just give that like button a hit, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you can receive word of any future uploads. And until next time, friends, good night.